Hello, this is Dr. Mike, and today we're going to talk about Chapter 7 of our study in developmental psychology, and we talk about the socio-emotional horizons of young people as they age through the lifespan. A very important chapter, and I think it's one that you'll gain some insights into young people out of directly, because these things have been studied. And so there's a lot of great indicators here of things that would help us as parents, but also would help us to be better professionals when we understand that there are things that will help us to understand our patients or our students if we're a teacher. And so it really does pay you to be very, very much up to date on these psychological developments as we go through the lifespan. So let me go to our slides here just briefly, and we'll pull those up and talk to you about the things that we need to consider today in this important study. I'm hoping that you find these studies important, because they do really help us, I think, and they'll be more valuable to you as you go along, because they become more and more important when you think about ways to understand the world around us, the people around us. As far as our objectives, by the end of the chapter, you ought to be able to describe the role of families and disruptions in families on a child's development. We know that there is a tremendous disruption on children from divorce and separations and things that happen in the family. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the peer relationships in middle childhood, and also potential benefits and drawbacks in the children's use of electronic media. This is always a major issue, and our children are very much involved in electronic media, and it does have an effect on their cognitive development, whether we like to understand that or not. And then, of course, understanding of peers and social groups in the middle childhood. These are very difficult years. These are years that we would probably call junior high years. I was a high school teacher for 12 years in a private school, which meant I taught junior high and high school. And I have to admit, my 7th grade science classes were probably some of the most difficult, because the children or the students were in that stage of trying to figure out who they were. And so they acted out a lot and did a lot of crazy things. And so as a result, those years are very hard to find people that want to teach in that age group. So we'll look at these family relationships and look at a couple of questions. What is the system's approach to parenting, which is a good question. What are the primary dimensions of parenting? How do they affect the child's development? What determines how siblings get along? How do firstborn, latterborn, and only children differ? I love the birth order argument. It's one of the most interesting things that I've read in a long time. How do divorce and remarriage affect children, and what factors lead to children being maltreated? When we think of family as a system, it is important for us to realize that the family structure evolved in a way to protect and nurture young children. One of the interesting things in history is that there was not always a concept of childhood. If you were to go back in the 12th and 13th century and look at the art and art galleries from that period, you would notice how they painted children were quite interested. They would have a small body, but they would have an adult face and head. The reality was that once you were 3 and 4 years old, that you went to work. And so you became an adult at 3, 4, 5 years old. And so when we get to about the 1500s, and of course, Martin Luther comes along with the Protestant Reformation, and he makes a statement, said, learn to read the Bible for yourself. Well, that was difficult for adults to do. And so they decided, well, maybe we could let our children learn to read the Bible. So they carved out this niche, if you will, that they call childhood, in which a child in its early years could learn to read, write, maybe do a little math. And so the idea of childhood became an established thing. Another interesting thing is that being a teenager, that didn't happen until the 1950s, mid-1950s. James Dean's movie, The Rebel, was the first time you ever heard a young person sass his parents or talk back to them. And that idea of adolescence became a major influence in our thinking about people. And so these things don't just they haven't always been there. We assume that these things have always been in place, but they're not. So the idea of childhood, the family structure as a way to protect, nurture, educate young children. It only started about 1500s. Theorists view families from a contextual perspective. They believe that families form a system of interacting elements. And if you think back to your own childhood, that's probably really true. The family itself is embedded in other social systems that can affect the family dynamics, like sports and church and all these other things, either directly or indirectly. But each family is its own functioning unit, and it works in ways to protect the child and allow that child to reach some level of maturity and self-functioning. So we see here this diagram shows us something of what that would look like. You have mother and father interacting with each other. You have two children. The children each interact with each other, with their parents in so many dimensions. But then you have all these other things like work and religious organizations and school and extended family and neighborhood in the culture that also interact with these children. I think may have been, I forget who wrote the book now, called It Takes a Community to Raise a Child. And that was really true in past days. If you lived in a community and your parents knew each other, worked together, you had a lot of parents, and they really worked together to raise all so many different dimensions of that. So when we think about dimensions and style of parenting, there are two general parenting dimensions: warm and responsive versus hostile and uninvolved. And I would ask you to take just a moment to think about which one of those you grew up in, and then which one of those kind of parents are you now. The extreme control versus no control. This psychological control refers to a parent's effort to manipulate their children, make them feel guilty, force them into doing things that they don't want to do from the aspect of guilt. Behavioral control refers to the parents' efforts to set rules for their children and to control what they do. There's a lot of difference between these two here, and you want to aim toward the behavioral control. You want to change a child's bad behavior and replace it with good behavior, and get them to do right. But you're not making them feel guilty and guilting them into doing that. So many parents do that. They will use guilt as a child raising tool, and that child, as a result, will go through their entire life feeling guilty for things that they shouldn't. 4 parenting styles that we ought to look at along these two dimensions and two levels. The authoritarian parenting is where there's high control and low warmth and responsiveness. The parent is not very warm, not very kind, not very helpful, but they're very controlling. The authoritative parenting is greater control, but they're warm and responsive. So they're much more the behavioral kind of control. They're trying to get you to do right. Then there's permissive parenting, where you have low control, but they're warm and friendly. And then there's uninvolved parenting, which has low control and low warmth, and they could care less. So they really don't try to do anything to keep their children inside the bounds of that relationship. So if you wanted to be one of these, it should be one of the two middle ones, probably preferably the authoritative parent. You want to control and guide and teach your children to do right, but you don't want to make them feel guilty. By the same token, you don't want to just turn them loose on the world either. There are a lot of variations that are associated with culture, socioeconomic status. Parenting styles vary across cultures. In Europe, European Americans are warm usually. They exert moderate control. They value individualism, while Asian and Latin parents value cooperation and collaboration, working together. It always has great feedback. Parenting styles also can vary within cultures. You'll have a lot of socioeconomic status entails stress on low-income people, lesser education, and or a need to protect children from danger. But this can result in controlling and punitive parenting, trying to save your children. I know in areas where people live in low income areas where there are gangs and there are drugs and all these other things, most parents are desperate trying to control their children, and they would probably do anything they could to keep their children out of that lifestyle. But the only thing is, when you use guilt and things like that to do that, it ends up producing something worse than what you're trying to save them from. So let's talk about parental behavior and the different aspects of that. Direct instruction is telling the child what to do and when, explain why you do that. It's a form of coaching. It's helping a child master social and emotional skills, but it also explains the link between the behavior and the emotion. So you really want to be in that position as a parent where you're coaching and giving direct instruction. Modeling is another good point. They learn by observing and imitating what parents do and say, and that's another big deal. Children are much more likely to model their behavior after their parent than they are after some stranger. And so it's very important that they learn early on to model their behavior. Feedback allows parents to indicate whether behavior is appropriate or inappropriate. You look to see if what you've done is reinforce the behavior, or if it's changed the behavior, or in the case of punishment, whether it had the desired result that you wanted. That's the important thing. Punishment can be effective when it is prompt and when it's consistent, when it's explained, and within good parenting relationship. Just to spank a child or punish a child to be doing it is the worst thing you possibly can do, because you will turn them into your enemy. But when you explain, my mother, I don't know how many times my mother came back to me after she spanked us and in tears said it hurt her more than it did us. And a good parent, that's true. It pains you. Punishment has some serious drawbacks. There are, the good thing about it is temporary, and then there are some undesirable side effects. A lot of people use timeout. When a child misbehaves, you take him and sit him alone and quiet. My sister-in-law told you about such a great babysitter. She used timeout. I'll never forget, she was keeping my aunt's grandchildren, and my aunt never got to have a very good relationship with them. But they were up at her house visiting one day by themselves, and my sister-in-law called her to be sure she didn't whip them, that she used timeout to punish them if they did something wrong. And offended my aunt to no end, but that's the way they were used to doing that. The marital system has great influence on a child's makeup, and especially in these middle years, like junior high, 7 to 12, whatever. There's a lot of harmful effects when chronic parenting is in conflict. It jeopardizes the child's feeling of a stable family. It makes children feel anxious. They're frightened, they're sad, they're much more likely to be obese. All these things happen when a child doesn't have a sense of a very stable home life. Parents who take a constructive approach to conflict can teach your children some great skills. Unemployment, work stress can undermine parenting skills, and parents need to work as a team, with each supporting the child in their own unique way, and explain to children, about unemployment. Don't just leave it for them to figure it out, to stress over it. The point is that children are under tremendous stresses today. They're stressed at school, they're from stress from their peer group, from their parents, from home, from grades, from school, all just a myriad of things. And so you really do need to keep in contact with the child to know what the stressors are and maybe how you can help to relieve some of those. So parents and children affect each other's behavior and the family. If it's a dysfunctional family, dysfunction in children can make it worse. Parenting styles differ with the child's age. That's another thing that most people don't take into account. If what worked to discipline a child at 5 does not work at 10 or 14. There's cognitive development. The mind has changed. They think differently. It's much easier to take them and show them what was going to be the result of their actions if they keep going down the road they're going, because they can understand that at 10, 11, 12. Adolescents want more autonomy, and they want input into decision making, and their well-being nourished as parents will gradually be able to release control, because they learn by doing and by learning, but they want that control to learn how to do it. Temperamentally active children may require greater parental control. You can imagine that already, and reciprocal influences lead to routine patterns of behaviors, and and interaction. So you basically want to get someone to the point of being self-disciplined. That's the important thing. The sibling can result in an older child withdrawing or regressing to childish behavior. I have a friend who just told their daughter this weekend that she's having a baby brother. She's 12. She's been the star of their existence for 12 years. And I don't know how well that went over, but they told her on her birthday that she was about to get a new brother or sister. And they were worried about how she was going to react because she has been the only child, the only grandchild, the only niece, nephew. And so everybody has pitted her amazingly. Sibling relationships are more harmonious in adolescent years than they are younger years. If the same sex, they're more harmonious. They have good emotion regulation, good temperaments. They work well. And when the parents have a good relationship, their older children tend to do the same. So those are things to be thinking about. Adopted children's a different organism, different setup. The best estimate is that of all U.S. children, 2 to 4% are adopted. The most common form of adoption is by foster parent or relative to adopt young children who are in foster care. Young children are also adopted through private agencies. With infants and the younger children are the ones that are adopted more often, and mostly teenagers, if they're in the system, will probably stay there until they age out. Infants and young children are adopted more often. And so most adopted kids do quite well. Some are more prone to conduct disorders and school adjustment problems like older children, other children are, but they learn to do that pretty well. Open adoption, when adopted children and their families communicate with their birth parents, is much more common today than it has been in the past. And so I think that's probably a good thing for the child. Uh, I mentioned a little bit about birth order, and I'll just say this. This is something that you really, if you want to understand children, that you ought to get your book and read about, because firstborns tend to have a higher IQ. They go further in school. They do more things. They travel. They do everything else. The second child, if you have three boys is your typical birth order. If you have three boys, the middle boy will be kind of quiet, shy, retracted. He'll do things like work on buses and drive school bus and, play sports, not so grade oriented. And then the third born will be kind of spoiled and laid back and probably doesn't go to college. One of the major problems in our day, of course, is divorce and remarriage. Probably 50% of American couples end up divorced and remarried, but they do have effect on the children. It depends on how well the parents cooperate with each other, especially when it comes to things like discipline. If you have one parent on one side, one on the other, you're going to have major problems. They'll have problems with school achievements, with conduct, with adjustment, self-concept, parent-child relations. They are likelier to experience negative marriage attitudes and marital problems, and they're more likely to divorce themselves and then have less satisfaction with life. That's really sad. When you have joint custody, both parents retain legal custody of their children following a divorce. It's an option when parents get along. In sole custody, children are far better with the same, same parent, and usually same-sex parent. They're better off with one parent or the other. Children benefit when fathers remain involved in the parenting, and that's something that's always been a problem. So the children most affected by divorce, they fare better when neither parent experiences any psychological problems, when parents get along with each other, when parents stay involved and parent effectively. Divorce is more harmful to temperamentally emotional children than those who interpret events negatively, and it's less harmful if parents explain divorce reasons to the children. If you sit down and explain to your child what is about to happen so that they're not questioning, they're not left in the dark, they're not about to lose one of their children, one of their parents, then they'll be much more able to do that. We live in a day when there are a lot of blended families. You have his, hers, and theirs, and making that work is a major issue. Typically, blended families is a mother and her children and a stepfather. Children can thrive in in a blended family, if they're close to their mother, stepfather, it's about the relationship. It's about putting the time into it that's necessary. Same-sex parenting is a fairly new thing for most people, but the first studies that have come in have proven that it has worked well. Same problems as a heterosexual couple. One thing that does make it very, very difficult, I think, is that two men can be married and have children, and the society looks upon them very differently than it does two women. Two women in a lesbian relationship can have children all day long. Nobody ever accuses them of being a pedophile. Nobody ever accuses them of molesting children. The statistics say, and I want to say this very clearly, but the statistics say that 83% of those that are pedophiles are heterosexual men. But they pretty well successfully pushed that off onto gay men. And so it's very difficult for gay men to get a hearing in a court of law as far as their own children in a custody case. They'll normally go to the mother unless they can prove that she's unfit or whatever. And then they look to the grandfather before many times they'll even look to the dad. So it's very interesting setup. So there's a lot of things where this can go bad, especially with children. They can be beaten. Large number of U.S. children were neglected and abused in some way every year. 75% inadequate food, clothing, and medical. So when you think about these relationships and think about the children are usually the ones that in these relationships that suffer the most from being in situations where the mom and dad are at war with each other or whatever. Resilience is the ability to respond, adapt and resourcefully take in new situations. That really does help to buffer against the abuse's effects sometimes, but being able to buffer and stand up against it. Some of you may have had the misfortune of having an abusive partner, and you know how that affects not only your life, but it affects the children's life. So basically, ways to prevent child mistreatment: you can reduce the positive attitude toward physical punishment, use timeout or something of that nature, reducing poverty and its stressful effects, maintain good support, and increase counseling and training for parents so that they can understand the needs to do that. The next section talks about the child's peers, and this is a really important section where we talk about the peer relationships of children, how important they are that they have friends of their own age group and their own understanding, and helps them to spend time together, build friendships. And that relationship is very, very important. It's really important for preschoolers to find people with common interests. It really does make going to school much easier if they know people in the class, if they know classmates. For adolescents, that is a little bit more tricky. They value loyalty and intimacy, but making sure they take care of themselves is very, very important. So consequences of friendship: they can benefit higher self-esteem. They feel needed, less likely to be lonely and depressed, and act more pro-socially, and they cope better with stresses when they have friends. So that's something to think about. Working in groups is another benefit of going to school as well. They may not be your best friends, but they're people you learn to work with. A clique, you have those in school. Sometimes a small number of children or adolescent individuals in attitude, sex, race, age, and they try to shun people and turn them out. You have a crowd. You have the dominance hierarchy, where there's a group of people that will dominate a class. I had that in my own school. They belonged to the town group, as we call them, and they all were members of the country club, and the rest of us got kind of shut out. There's a great deal of peer influence at this age, and you need to watch your children very carefully that they don't get overcome by that, because it is really big and really powerful. Electronic media, we're going to talk about that. It's really important because our young people tend to be caught up in that so much today. But in a typical day, American children spend 5 hours in front of a screen. That includes computers, phones, television. Adolescents will do 2 more hours, not including homework. So what do children learn from that? They learn gender stereotypes. They learn aggressiveness, risky behavior, impulsivity from TV. I read somewhere that by the time a child is 18 years old, that they have watched 1,000 murders on television. So it lowers their threshold of right and wrong. And of course, that was always the challenge of TV and videos as well, long before we got all this stuff in our hands. Video games now are much more violent than they've ever been. And students spend more and more time in front of them, mockingly killing each other and all those things, and have no concept of being able to overcome. They shoot somebody on a video screen, they die and get up and go on with the war. So basically, that's the problem. So as you look at this chapter, you ought to be able to think about these, understanding, something about peer groups and social groups and the benefits and drawbacks of electronic media, the peer relationships in middle school and how those operate, and the families and the disruption in families on a child's development. Some of you may be very concerned about that. And I invite you to read this section of the chapter and ask questions and make points, because this is one of the more important chapters. And I'd like to see you really dive into that. So when we think about this socio motor emotional kind of a situation, we realize these are important developments. If a child gets stunted or something happens during those years, then they're going to be likely to fall behind. So it's well worth us looking at and thinking about. And as you get ready to go into this week, read that section and give it some thought. Okay, we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.